When you eat a piece of fruit, when you eat an orange, is that fructose for you? And the answer is no, it's not. It is not for you. And the reason it's not for you is because the fiber in that orange, unless of course you juiced it, but if you didn't, the fiber in that orange sets up a matrix, a gel, on the inside of your duodenum. The insoluble fiber forms the lattice work of the gel, like a fishnet. The soluble fiber, the pectins and the inulin, like what holds jelly together, plug the holes in the fishnet. And together, those two, the soluble and insoluble fiber that is found in an orange, will form a secondary barrier on the inside of the duodenum. You can actually see it on electron microscopy.
And you call it the duodenum?
Duodenum.
Duodenum.
That's the first part of the intestine after the stomach.
Okay, got it.
And that's where a lot of the simple sugars get absorbed. Now, you don't want to be absorbing simple sugars in your duodenum. You want them to go further down the intestine to the second part, called the jejunum. And the jejunum is where the bacteria are, the microbiome. So when you consume that piece of fruit, that orange, the fiber is preventing early absorption. So you don't get that glucose or fructose rise. And so therefore your liver never has to process it. Your liver stays healthy. You stay below your capacity to metabolize that fructose. So you stay below your threshold. And because you didn't metabolize it, since you didn't absorb it early, it goes further down the intestine, and the microbiome chews it up for its purposes. So you actually fed your gut. So you protected your liver and you fed your gut, all because of the fiber in the fruit. So what I always told my patients was, when nature made the poison, it packaged it with the antidote. The fiber means that that sugar was not for you. It was for your microbiome. So we shouldn't even count it in terms of the, quote, calories in, because it wasn't for you. In fact, 25 to 30% of all the food you eat goes to the microbiome to keep those bacteria happy, healthy, and complacent. And when you don't feed them, that's when all hell breaks loose. And that's when you start getting all the diseases of chronic metabolic disease, all of the diseases of intestinal inflammatory disease, because the microbiome has basically taken over your intestine.
Just a clarifying point to connect two things that you've talked about, right? So you're talking about the Inuit and their diet.
Yep.
And they were primarily sustaining on not really having any forms of carbohydrate inside of their diet.
Right.
So what happened to them? You know, you were mentioning they didn't have cancer, other things.
Right.
Did they have all these?
And they didn't have fiber either.
And they didn't have fiber. So is that sort of a case that there might be, you know, the human body is quite adaptive, and whether you look at the Tarahumara tribe that's, you know, running in, you know, Central America and Mexico, and are descendants of the Aztec, and they have 80% of their diet comes from carbohydrates. So you have the Inuit who have 0% or maybe 1% come from carbohydrates.
Right.
That the human body is quite adaptive as long as it's eating whole foods.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Drew. In fact, there are multiple types of diets that work. Okay. All the indigenous cultural diets that, human existence grew up on, they all worked. It's only the Western diet that doesn't. So if you're a gatherer and you're getting your energy primarily from carbohydrate, you are also consuming it with the requisite fiber in order to basically keep the microbiome healthy, because the fiber is the food for the bacteria.
We're not having large amounts of refined carbohydrates.
Exactly.
In our traditional diets.
Almost no traditional diet has large amounts of refined carbohydrate. The closest would be the Japanese, because they had a lot of white polished rice. But they also had a lot of fermented vegetables too. Mm-hmm. So they made up for it in other ways. All right. Now, you also have the carnivores, the Inuit and, people on, the ketogenic diet. Now, you can still have green vegetables on a ketogenic diet and you can still get your fiber. But there are a lot of people who are like straight carnivores and they're fine too. So how come if they're not consuming fiber? And the answer is because they're consuming the other things that those bacteria need that basically ultimately feed them. So they are consuming a lot of amino acids. Those amino acids will ultimately be turned into short-chain fatty acids. Those short-chain fatty acids are food for the bacteria as well. So ultimately, the goal is feed your gut. And you can feed it one of two ways. You can feed it with fiber, or you can feed it with the stuff of meat and what's on a ketogenic diet, milk too. The one thing that you can't do is feed it fructose.
Now, you and I were chatting a little bit beforehand, and we were talking about Dr. Rick Johnson being on the podcast and my interview with him. And he did a whole deep dive into fructose and its relationship potentially with Alzheimer's that they're seeing.
Right.
And he put out a paper with Dr. Dale Bredesen, and who will be coming out on the podcast, is also a big fan of yours, and also